He didn't need guns. He had something more dangerous: politicians in his pocket, judges on his payroll, and a smile that could buy loyalty or bury enemies. They called him the Prime Minister, and for 30 years, he ruled an empire built on handshakes, not bullets. January 26, 1891, Lauropoli, Calabria, Italy. A mountain village so poor that survival was the only industry. In a stone house where the winter cold crawled through the walls, Giuseppe and Maria Castiglia welcomed a son into the world. They named him Francesco Castiglia, but the world would come to know him as Frank Costello, the Prime Minister of the Underworld. Francesco's early years were marked by hunger, dust, and the crushing weight of poverty. His father, a laborer, could barely feed his family. In 1895, when Francesco was just 4 years old, his mother packed their few belongings and boarded a ship to America with Francesco and his older brother Edward. They left the mountains of Calabria behind and sailed toward the promise of a new life. They arrived in New York City and settled in East Harlem, a cramped, dirty neighborhood where Italian immigrants squeezed into tenement buildings that smelled like sewage in desperation. Giuseppe had opened a small Italian grocery store, but it barely kept them alive. In America, poverty spoke a different language, but it crushed you just the same. Young Francesco, now called Frank, grew up fast. By age 13, he joined a street gang and started committing petty crimes: burglary, assault, robbery. In 1908, at 17, he was arrested for assault and robbery. In 1912, arrested again for robbery. In 1915, arrested for carrying a concealed weapon and sentenced to 1 year in prison. But something changed during that year behind bars. Frank Costello made a decision. He would never carry a gun again. Not because he was afraid, but because guns were for idiots who didn't know how to use their minds. Frank Costello didn't want to be a soldier. He wanted to be a king. And in 1914, he met a Jewish girl named Loretta Geigerman. A Roman Catholic marrying a Jewish girl? In those days, it was scandalous. But Frank didn't care about tradition. He married her. They would stay together for nearly 60 years, until his death. No children, just loyalty. And then, one day in a movie theater balcony, Frank Costello met the man who would change his life forever. A young Sicilian street punk named Charles Lucky Luciano. They were both kicked out of the theater for throwing trash at the audience below, and a partnership was born. In 1920, the United States government made the most profitable mistake in history. They banned alcohol. The 18th Amendment, Prohibition, turned every bar, speakeasy, and corner store into a goldmine for anyone willing to break the law. And Frank Costello? He saw the future. By this time, Costello had changed his name. Francesco Castiglia sounded too Italian, too ethnic, too obvious. So he became Frank Costello, a name that sounded Irish, respectable, American. He understood something most gangsters didn't. Perception is power. Working with Lucky Luciano, Costello joined the gang of Giuseppe "Joe the Boss" Masseria, the head of what would later become the Genovese crime family. But Costello also worked with Irish bootleggers, men like Bill Dwyer and Oni Madden, who ran massive rum-running operations known as the Combine. When Dwyer was convicted of bribing a U.S. Coast Guard official in 1927, Costello took over his bootlegging empire. He wasn't the muscle, he was the brain. And brains outlive muscle every time. But Costello's real mentor wasn't a gangster, it was a businessman. Arnold Rothstein, the legendary gambler who fixed the 1919 World Series, taught Costello the most important lesson of his life. Money doesn't come from violence, it comes from connections. Rothstein ran a bookmaking empire and protected it by owning politicians in Tammany Hall, the corrupt political machine that controlled New York City. Costello watched and learned. He saw how Rothstein used cash, not threats, to buy district attorneys, judges, and police commissioners. Rothstein taught him that the real power wasn't in the streets, it was in City Hall. When Rothstein was murdered in 1928 over a gambling debt, Costello inherited his political connections, and he used them to build an empire. Costello formed alliances with Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel. two Jewish gangsters who would become legends. He worked with Vito Genovese and Tommy Lucchese, two Sicilian mobsters who would one day run their own families. Together, they formed a criminal network that would dominate organized crime for decades. But not everyone was happy about it. The old-school Sicilian mafiosi hated Costello. They called him the Dirty Calabrian because he wasn't Sicilian. They warned Luciano not to work with him. Luciano ignored them, and history was made. In May 1929, Costello helped organize the Atlantic City Conference, a summit of mob bosses from across America designed to create peace and establish territories. It was Costello's idea, and it worked. The National Crime Syndicate was born, a nationwide criminal organization that controlled bootlegging, gambling, and stuff trafficking from New York to Chicago to Los Angeles. Costello earned a new nickname that day, the Prime Minister of the Underworld. Not because he was the toughest, not because he killed the most people, but because he was the one who made peace. He was the diplomat, the negotiator, the man who kept the mob from tearing itself apart. In 1929, a war erupted in New York that would reshape the American Mafia forever. Joe, the boss. Masseria, Costello's boss, went to war with Salvatore Maranzano for control of the city's criminal rackets. The Castellamarese War turned the streets of New York into a battlefield. Bodies piled up, businesses burned, loyalties shifted, and in the middle of it all, Costello and Luciano made a calculation. Both bosses had to die. On April 15, 1931, Luciano lured Masseria to a Coney Island restaurant called Nuova Via Tamaro. While they ate pasta and played cards, Luciano excused himself to the bathroom. Then the shooters walked in. Vito Genovese, Albert Anastasia, Joe Adonis, and Bugsy Siegel. They shot Masseria to death while he sat at the table. Maranzano declared himself the winner and named himself boss of all bosses. But Luciano and Costello weren't done. On September 10, 1931, 4 Jewish gunmen, provided by Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel, walked into Maranzano's Manhattan office and killed him. In 6 months, 2 mob bosses were dead, and Luciano took control. Luciano became the head of what would become the Genovese family. He named Vito Genovese his underboss. And Frank Costello? He became consigliere, the family's top advisor, the diplomat, the fixer. This was Costello's golden age. He controlled slot machines across New York, 50,000 machines in candy stores, restaurants, nightclubs, markets, and bars. Each machine earned him a fortune. Together, they generated $500,000 a day. Costello also partnered with Louisiana Governor Huey Long and New Orleans mob boss Carlos Marcello to expand slot machine operations into Louisiana. The Louisiana contingent got 10% of the take. Everyone made money. And Costello made sure everyone stayed happy. He didn't need to carry a gun. He had something better: politicians on his payroll. Legend has it that during the 1930s and 1940s, no judge reached the bench in New York without Costello's approval. He attended the 1932 Democratic National Convention with Manhattan's Democratic boss, Jimmy Hines, and helped Franklin D. Roosevelt win the presidential nomination. Frank Costello didn't just run the mob, he ran the city. In 1936, Lucky Luciano was convicted of running a prostitution ring and sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison. Vito Genovese, Luciano's brutal, ruthless underboss, took over as acting boss. But Costello and Genovese hated each other. Genovese was a killer, a man who solved problems with bullets and blood. Costello was a businessman, a man who solved problems with bribes and handshakes. They couldn't have been more different. In 1937, Genovese was charged with the 1934 murder of mobster Ferdinand Boccia. Rather than face trial, he fled to Italy to avoid prosecution, where he befriended Benito Mussolini's son-in-law and allegedly supplied him with powder. With Genovese gone, Luciano, still in prison, appointed Frank Costello as acting boss of the family. Costello finally had the throne, but he never wanted it. Costello's underboss was his cousin Willie Moretti, who commanded a crew of 60 enforcers. While Moretti handled the muscle, Costello focused on the money: gambling, slot machines, prostitution, loan sharking, and labor union corruption. He expanded legitimate businesses, including large poultry and meatpacking operations. He avoided stuff trafficking entirely. It brought too much heat from the feds. Costello also invested heavily in Las Vegas and Cuba. He partnered with dandy Phil Castile to open the Beverly Club in New Orleans, and later helped finance the Tropicana Hotel in Las Vegas. Costello was building a gambling empire that stretched from New York to Havana, but his refusal to get involved in stuff created tension. Genovese, who had made millions from narcotics in Italy, wanted back in. And when World War II ended in 1945, Genovese returned to America. The murder charges against him were dismissed after the key witness died in jail, allegedly poisoned with enough poison to kill 6 horses. No one doubted who ordered the hit. Genovese demanded that Costello compensate him with a share of the rackets he'd missed out on while hiding in Italy. Costello refused. The war between them had begun. In 1950, U.S. Senator Estes Kefauver launched a series of televised hearings to investigate organized crime in America. Over 600 mob figures were called to testify, and the biggest star? Frank Costello. Most mobsters invoked the Fifth Amendment and refused to answer questions. But Costello didn't. He showed up in a tailored suit, calm and confident, and argued that he was a legitimate businessman who paid his taxes. But there was one problem. Costello refused to have his face photographed or televised, so the cameras focused on his hands, his fidgeting, nervous hands, as he testified. Those hands became the most famous hands in America. Millions of Americans watched as Costello answered questions about his gambling operations, his political connections, and his role in organized crime. He admitted knowing politicians, judges, and police commissioners, but he denied being a mob boss. Senator Kefauver concluded that Costello was the power behind Tammany Hall, and that Carmine DiSapio, the Tammany leader, was assisting him in making political decisions. Costello had been exposed. The prime minister's reign was crumbling. In 1952, Costello was convicted of contempt of the Senate for walking out of the hearings. He served 14 months in prison. In 1954, he was convicted of tax evasion and sentenced to 5 years. He served 42 months before the conviction was overturned on appeal. But the damage was done. Costello's political power was gone. And Vito Genovese saw his chance. May 2, 1957, Manhattan. Costello had just finished dinner with his wife and friends. He caught a cab back to his apartment at 115 Central Park West, a luxury building called the Majestic Apartments. As his cab pulled up to the building, a black Cadillac pulled in behind it. A massive man, over 300 pounds, jumped out and followed Costello into the marble lobby. The man hid behind a pillar. Then he shouted, "This is for you, Frank." Costello turned toward the voice. The gunman fired. One shot, point-blank range. But as Costello turned, the bullet grazed his scalp above his ear. It didn't penetrate his skull. It didn't kill him. It barely scratched him. The shooter, Vincent the Chin Gigante, Genovese's chief enforcer, panicked and ran back to the Cadillac, not realizing Costello had survived. He sped off into the Manhattan streets. Costello was taken to the hospital with a superficial head wound. Police questioned him. "Who shot you, Frank?" they asked. "I didn't see him. I don't know who it was." The doorman, however, had seen everything. He described the shooter, a 6-foot-tall man with a stocky build. Police put 66 detectives on the case. Within days, they arrested Vincent Gigante. Gigante stood trial for attempted murder in 1958. But when prosecutors asked Costello to identify his attacker, Costello refused. He obeyed omertà, the mafia's code of silence. Gigante was acquitted, but Costello got the message. Genovese wanted him dead or gone. Costello announced his retirement shortly after. He surrendered control of the Luciano crime family to Vito Genovese. The family that Luciano built and Costello ran would now be known as the Genovese crime family. But retirement didn't mean irrelevance. Costello remained a consultant to mob bosses across America. Carlo Gambino and Tommy Lucchese still visited him at his penthouse in the Waldorf Astoria, seeking advice, paying respect. He was still the prime minister, just without the throne. When police searched Costello after the assassination attempt, they found something strange in his coat pocket. A handwritten note with gambling figures. The numbers matched, to the decimal point. The casino win at the Tropicana Hotel in Las Vegas, which had opened just weeks earlier on April 3, 1957. Federal investigators quickly connected the dots. The Tropicana was partially financed by dandy Phil Castile, Costello's longtime partner in gambling operations, including the Beverly Club in New Orleans. Costello owned a piece of the Tropicana, and now the feds knew it. The Nevada Gaming Control Board traced the Costello link to two rogues employees at the Tropicana, Executive Director Louis Lederer and cashier Michael Tanico. Both promptly left the casino. The Tropicana announced it would repay Castile's investment to distance itself from mob ties. Costello's Las Vegas dream was over. But the bullet had done more than graze his skull. It had exposed his empire. Costello spent his final years living quietly in his Waldorf Astoria penthouse and later at his Long Island estate. He kept a low profile, but he never truly left the life. Mob bosses still came to him for advice. Politicians still owed him favors. In February 1961, after years of legal battles, the U.S. Supreme Court overturned a deportation order against him. He was staying in America. In his majestic apartment's home at 18F, Costello lived in luxury. His interior decorator, James Mont, the mob's favorite, had decked the apartment in Mafia glitz. A Howard Chandler Christie oil painting over the fireplace, a gold-plated grand piano in the living room, and slot machines manufactured by Costello's True Mint novelty company. But here's the twist. The slot machines in Costello's apartment were rigged for perpetual jackpots. He used to say to guests like publisher Generoso Pope Jr. and future New York Mayor Bill O'Dwyer, "What do you think I am, a punk? Nobody loses in my house." On February 18, 1973, Frank Costello died of a heart attack at age 82 in a Manhattan hospital. He was buried at St. Michael's Cemetery in Queens. He died in his sleep. No bullets, no betrayal. Just old age. At his funeral, mob bosses from across America came to pay their respects. But so did politicians, judges, and businessmen. Men who owed their careers to Costello's influence. The Prime Minister was dead. But his empire lived on. Frank Costello was different from every other mob boss in history. He didn't revel in violence. He didn't seek headlines. He didn't need to be feared. He needed to be respected. While men like Al Capone and Vito Genovese built empires on blood and terror, Costello built his on handshakes and bribes. He understood that politicians were more valuable than hitmen, and judges were more powerful than guns. He turned Tammany Hall into his personal political machine. He helped elect mayors, judges, and district attorneys. He attended fundraisers with senators and dined with governors. He moved easily in the world outside the mob, something Genovese could never do. Author Leonard Katz, who wrote a biography of Costello, described him as not soft, but human. He was civilized. He spurned the bloody violence in which previous bosses had reveled. But don't mistake civility for weakness. Costello ordered hits when necessary. When Abe Kid Twist Reles, one of Murder Inc.'s top executioners, turned informant and started cooperating with authorities, Costello allegedly arranged for him to be thrown out of a hotel window while under police protection. The witness died. The case collapsed. Costello walked free. Mario Puzo modeled the character of Don Vito Corleone in The Godfather, partly on Frank Costello, the soft-spoken, politically connected boss who ruled through diplomacy rather than violence. And Vito Genovese, the man who tried to kill him. He was convicted of dope trafficking in 1959 and sentenced to 15 years in the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. He died in prison on Valentine's Day 1969. Vincent the Chin Gigante, the man who shot Costello, went on to become one of the most powerful mob bosses in history. For over 2 decades, he ran the Genovese family while pretending to be insane, wandering the streets of Greenwich Village in a bathrobe, muttering to himself. But he never forgot that night in 1957 when he fired a bullet at Frank Costello and missed. They called him the Prime Minister, not because he killed the most people, but because he didn't have to. While others ruled with fear, he ruled with favors. While others bought guns, he bought judges. While others fought wars, he made peace. Frank Costello understood what most gangsters never learn. Violence is loud, expensive, and temporary. But power? Real power is quiet, patient, and eternal. He didn't need to carry a gun. He had politicians in his pocket, judges on his payroll, and a network of allies that stretched from New York to Havana to Las Vegas. And when Vito Genovese sent a bullet to kill him, Costello survived, because even assassins can't kill an idea. And the idea of Frank Costello? It's still alive, still whispered in boardrooms and backrooms, still taught in law schools and mob museums. The Prime Minister is dead, but his empire? It never really ended. It just learned to wear a suit and a smile.